Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star, coming to you from a relatively modest confines here, just back at my hotel at the residence. And this is your Friday rundown for October 10th, 2025. Full disclosure, shooting it Thursday night because I'll be traveling back from Chicago for a fair bit of Friday after Big Ten basketball media days here in Rosemont, to be more specific, near Big Ten headquarters, near O'Hare Airport. A lot to cover, and just going to kind of do it in a true rundown fashion today because there was a lot of ground to cover. First things first, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. As always, we've really been encouraged by how much we've been able to expand our audience here, our offerings here, the added engagement that we've been able to sort of provide to all of you here. So please like and subscribe the channel and keep coming back for more content. Also, IndyStar.com/sports, of course, had multiple stories up, HeraldTimesOnline.com as well, from me, from Mike Nislik, from everything Darian DeVries, Tucker DeVries, Lamar Wilkerson, and others had to say from Big Ten Media Day. So kind of an early plug up front, if you will, for all of our coverage from here in Rosemont, and what is in many ways very much the sort of ceremonial beginning of college basketball season in this part of the country. To just kind of do the IU stuff first, and then take a slightly sort of wider gaze. Darren DeVries, a few different things. Talked a lot about his belief in this team's ability to shoot. And I think a lot of that really did revolve around Tucker DeVries and Lamar Wilkerson. Talked a lot about how important he thinks it's going to prove to be for Tucker that he got a full off season because he chose to have the shoulder surgery. Those shoulder injuries have kind of been lingering for Tucker DeVries for a couple of years. He chose to just shut down in January and have that surgery, and that allowed him basically a proper off season for the first time in a while, something we've heard Tucker DeVries talk about as being very important. Other than that, a lot of the questions you would expect around things like fan engagement and, how he's found the job. I wrote something about how, sort of the way that we have seen some of his predecessors shy away from the spotlight of the job, the pressure of the job, the interest in the job. It seems like DeVries is really kind of running, headlong into all of that, trying to almost like weaponize that pressure into something he can use to help rebuild this program, interest that he can drum up within his fan base to help rebuild this program. In terms of kind of just like little bits and pieces, about the furthest he would go on his team's health was to say that Indiana would not be fully healthy to start the season as a roster. That's not a surprise. We've seen a number of players, most recently Josh Harris, Alexa Ristich, Jason Drake, Nick Dorn, all in various states of either injury or recovery. It does sound like Dorn is still working his way back, and it will be interesting to track. I'm shooting this again on Thursday night, October 9th. It'll be interesting to track whether Dorn's available for either of Indiana's upcoming exhibition games. The Marion game is the 17th. It's 8 days from now at time of recording. The Baylor game is the 26th, so that's a little bit further on. Is Dorn back on the floor for either of those, and is he at least in a place where Indiana is kind of building his minutes back up there early in the season? Because I do think he is a player that could factor pretty heavily into DeVries' rotation pretty quickly once he is not just fully healthy, but sort of fully ready for extended game action. It's worth saying he's missed basically the entire offseason, so it will probably take a little while to build him up to that. We also talked, obviously, at length with Lamar Wilkerson and Tucker DeVries, who are Indiana's player representatives today. I think we saw this in Puerto Rico. I think you see it even more when you see the two of them interact in a setting like this. There's a clear leadership dynamic between them. I think they recognize, just as their teammates do, they are Indiana's, I would say, likely top two leading scorers. They are probably Indiana's two most dynamic offensive players. And they're two of Indiana's, obviously Indiana's got an experienced roster, but they're two of Indiana's most experienced players as well. Players who've, obviously in Tucker DeVries' case, know the system very well, know the coach very well. In both of their cases are very comfortable being, kind of that alpha player for a team, being that player that, a team knows this is where we go for an important bucket. This is where we go in an important possession. And I think you can, you got the sense from sort of watching them sitting, talking to one another today that they've learned to sort of start to lean on one another as well. And that each of them kind of recognizes what the other is capable of, what the other can do for them, not just on the court, but in the intangible aspects as well, the leadership aspects, the experience aspects, and so forth. I think that's very important. And I think you get the sense that they are both sort of comfortable as table setters for this team. And I think that in a lot of ways they lean on one another to kind of give them the support they need to be able to go out and really provide that foundation for a lot of their teammates. And listen, at events like media days, you're going to get all the cliches, you're going to get all the boilerplate stuff. So you don't want to overstate it too much. But it does, even going back to the summer, going back to Puerto Rico, now seeing them here, you watch those two interact in particular, and you feel like you're looking at the two players that maybe they both recognize their importance to their team, and the two players that their team recognizes as perhaps being most important for Indiana. Some wider Big Ten stuff, a lot of the usual fare. Purdue, it's fair to say, is the preseason favorite with two, first-team all-conference preseason picks in Braden Smith and Trey Kaufman-Renn. Full disclosure for Purdue fans that have made it 6 minutes into this video, I voted Michigan 1 and Purdue 2. That was a very, very narrow hair to split. I think those two are pretty clearly the class of the conference at this point in the calendar. But the expectation is that those two will kind of set the pace, and then you'll see some teams that fill in behind them, the likes of your Michigan States, your Illinois, maybe a UCLA with some intriguing, roster additions, not least, of course, Donovan Dent, the transfer, sort of competing in behind them. Yeah, there was some buzz, I think it's fair to say, pun unintended, about the new coaches in the conference, namely DeVries, Ben McCollum at Iowa, who was, also in some quarters seen as a candidate for this job. Buzz Williams, who I feel like it's almost gone under the radar a little bit, and I'm not sure quite why, but that Buzz is in the conference. Now, of course, he's been around for so long, he's been so successful for so long, but now he's at Maryland and is really trying to sort of get that program over maybe a certain hump that it's not been able to in terms of consistent Big Ten competitiveness, really, since it came into the conference. The other really interesting thing, and this will be kind of our deep dive in a minute, but just to take a 10,000-foot view of it first, the other interesting thing was Tony Petitti talked today, which he does not, the Big Ten commissioner does not always talk at basketball media days. He gives kind of historically he gives a sort of a State of the Union at football media days and then takes a few questions. Petitti basically just had a Q&A session for about 25 minutes. He just sort of stood in front of reporters, and there were no opening remarks. There were no sort of prepared, accomplishments that he wanted to run through or anything like that. He was just saying, any questions you have for the Big Ten commissioner, go ahead and ask him. And there were a few noteworthy things. He was supportive of tournament expansion, which is I think entering back into sort of the mainstream here a little bit. Recently, he was supportive of the CSC and the NIL Go collective clearinghouse structure. Said it was always going to come with some hiccups and some growing pains, but he's confident in the direction that it's moving under the leadership that it has. Still firmly supportive of the SCORE Act, which is the piece of legislation that's been sort of crawling its way through the House of Representatives for quite some time now. He did mention the SAFE Act, which was the Democrat-backed bill announced in late September. The SAFE Act itself is probably, at least my impression, is probably something approaching dead on arrival politically in the Senate because of Ted Cruz's position within the Commerce Committee. But it was, in some ways, it did mirror a little bit more of what President Trump had kind of laid out in his executive action around college athletics earlier this year. And so it at least felt maybe significant as a potential roadmap to something more amenable long term. Petitti didn't have as much to say about the SAFE Act. He said himself, he thinks he's been to Congress maybe 14, 15 times to lobby for the SCORE Act. Which has been around a lot longer. The SCORE Act has been, sort of working its way through for months and months. The SAFE Act is, basically like 2 weeks old. The SCORE Act also probably has a little bit more juice behind it at this point because it has been able to gain that momentum over time. But he did acknowledge the SAFE Act as well as the SCORE Act. And then the other thing that he at least sort of tacitly acknowledged was the Big Ten's exploration of some kind of private equity partnership. It was reported by ESPN and then others And just a few days ago that the Big Ten is exploring, I think that the price tag is a $2 billion private equity partnership. The partner on the private equity side was not clear whether perhaps there were multiple partners, multiple bids, multiple proposals being considered. But Petitti did just kind of tacitly acknowledge that is there, and that is something the conference is considering. I would say, and I'll drop it in the. I wrote an insider off of this on Thursday afternoon, just kind of asking basically, is this worth it? And arguing that, on the merits of what we know so far, and of course, Tony Petitti is not going to spill out every detail of this in public, but on the merits of what we know so far, it feels like the answer is probably no. But I'll drop that link into the sort of the show notes here if you'd like to read that at indystar.com/sports. Just to kind of cliff notes some bits of that, I think there are a few things that stand out. Number one, $2 billion may seem like a lot of money, and obviously it is to the average person. But in a conference that has an average annual value in its media rights deal of roughly $1 billion a year, $2 billion is not a panacea that just sort of solves forever and a whole host of problems. It solves certainly a lot of problems of today, but especially when you consider what private equity tends to ask you to do on the back end of these kinds of partnerships, it could create just as many partners or problems and complications down the line. I would also point out, that the Big Ten has said a private equity partnership like this would allow the Big Ten the resources to be able to sort of bundle a lot of its individual schools, sort of branding and sponsorship appeal together into something called Big Ten Enterprises. And the idea being, if you are selling the Big Ten as a whole brand with each of its schools contributing to the strength of that brand, rather than each of those schools going out and negotiating some of these partnerships individually, everyone might get more money out of the deal. But again, it still feels, frankly, like you're having to sort of cheapen some of that to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. And in the same breath, I think I looked this up. The Chicago White Sox were valued at about $2 billion. Obviously, professional sports franchise has a lot more direct value than, maybe an individual college athletics department. But is the Big Ten is the entire Big Ten conference really only worth what the Chicago White Sox are worth? I'm not sure that is totally accurate. Does the money go enough to justify what private equity again will demand on the back end when you're trying to sort of make some of these moves to bolster your ability to save and invest in non-revenue sports, among other things? Well, what happens when private equity comes back and says we're looking for some streamlining because we would like to see greater return on investment, in this partnership? Again, it feels like it just creates some problems at the back end that you're trying to solve at the front end, and that's obviously, kind of chasing good money with bad in some ways. And the other thing I would point out, I think more than anything else, from a practical standpoint, there doesn't seem to be, and Maria Cantwell, who was the Democratic senator who introduced the SAFE Act last month, she had a quote that ESPN's Dan Murphy, and I don't have it right in front of me, but ESPN's Dan Murphy tweeted out earlier today that basically just kind of called into question whether it was a legitimate purpose, whether private equity really belonged in college sports if we are still endorsing the idea of college sports' wider mission, and college athletics' wider mission within the framework of what is, in her mind, sort of a public entity, which is higher education, particularly public higher education in this country. And I don't think you want to be picking a fight with Congress on that right now when you are, sort of, as Petitti himself said, just so consistently lobbying Congress to try and help you find solutions to the problems that already exist in the structure and in sort of the complexion of college athletics as we know it in 2025. I'm not at all sort of ignorant to the needs of these athletics departments, even some of the richest ones in all of college sports. I'm just not sure that private equity, at least at sort of the price, and insofar as what we know of them, the price and the terms being sort of publicly reported are worth it. And that's, again, if you want to read more on that, click the link in in the show notes. But we'll leave it there for now. Again, that Friday rundown was a little bit of just kind of regurgitating a lot of stuff at once. Apologies, but a lot really did come out of Big Ten Media Days, even not just from an IU perspective, but from a conference-wide perspective, and it felt important to just kind of present all that in a way that just sort of laid it all out and kind of coalesced it all in one place. We'll be back this weekend with 3 keys to the Oregon game. Mike Neislick will be in Eugene. I'll be covering from home. We'll obviously, coordinate all the usuals for you on what is one of the biggest games, certainly of the season, really in program history for Indiana. It'll be fascinating to see how the Hoosiers perform in Eugene. But for now, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. This has been the Friday Rundown for October 10th, 2025. We'll talk to you soon.